A few weeks ago, while running an errand, I happened to hear a report on the local radio station. The story was about one of the major insurance companies. I forget which one it was exactly. And according to this story, this insurance company had developed a radically new approach to teen drivers education. Now, I have a 16-year-old daughter, Lydia, whom some of you met last Sunday. Lydia just got her driver's license last fall, and I still vividly remember teaching her how to drive. So you can imagine that this report on the radio immediately piqued my interest. The report was in fact very enlightening, but not so much about teenagers as I had anticipated, but about fellow parents. First, I learned that for a large majority of parents, the prospect of their teenager learning to drive a car causes major anxieties. In some cases, even mild panic. As a result, many parents employ what might be called the scare you into good driving approach. Now, the scare you into good driving method consists in sitting your teenager down, even before they get behind the steering wheel, and giving them a long lecture about the terrifying dangers of teen driving. The presentation may include grim statistics about car crashes, broken down by age group, drunk drivers, and by those who were texting or using their cell phones while driving. And then many parents figure their shell-shocked and emotionally traumatized teenager will be ready for their first driving lesson. According to the story I heard on the radio, it was only recently that some experts began to question this time-tested approach. They began to wonder whether being terrified out of your mind is really the best starting point for becoming a good driver. And so they developed what you might call a positive reinforcement approach to teen drivers education. In this radio report I listened to, this was billed as a brand new, indeed a revolutionary program. I don't know about you, but to me it sounds like just plain common sense. It seems plain common sense not to whip your teenager in a frenzy and in a panic before they get behind the steering wheel for the first time. It seems much more sensible to encourage your teenager, to build up their self-confidence, to tell them that they're up to the task, and to be patient with them when they don't get it right the first time, to praise them when they do get it right, when they do look in the rearview mirror and set the blinkers before they change lanes. Now, in thinking about this report on the radio, I began to realize that these two radically different approaches to teen drivers education are but examples of a much larger pattern, of a fundamental choice each of us makes each and every day. Every day, in our interaction with others, we continuously choosing either to encourage or to criticize those with whom we come in contact, whether family members or friends, perhaps our spouse, or complete strangers. What is your preferred style? Do I seek to expose the shortcomings of other people, or do I seek to instill pride in their abilities? Do I have a habit of pointing out the mistakes of my co-workers, my spouse, my children, or other folks perhaps in this church? Or is my practice to acknowledge, to affirm, to nurture a person's gifts and talents, and their perhaps yet undeveloped skills? And which of the two approaches is more effective? Our gospel lesson for this morning is a wonderful way to reflect on that very question. because the familiar story of Zacchaeus and Jesus illustrates precisely these two different options and their effect, not just on individuals, but also on a whole community. The place of our story is Jericho, and just like it is today, Jericho in Jesus' time is a city under occupation. Today, Jericho's occupiers are the Israelis. Back in Jesus' day, it was the Romans who prevented Jericho's residents from running their own affairs. And as we all know, people who live under occupation are usually not a very happy lot. Things are tense, anger smolders under the surface, and can erupt into open violence at any minute. Those who dare to collaborate with the occupiers are in for special contempt. They are the hate of everybody's, the target of everybody's hate and contempt. And in the eyes of the people of Jericho, Zacchaeus was the perhaps most notorious of these contemptible traitors. He had made common sense with the Romans. The Romans had the habit of imposing a heavy tax on the people they had conquered, all of which flowed straight to Rome without benefiting the people under occupation. Naturally, the people hated paying that occupation tax even more than many Americans hate paying taxes, and the day that we are reminded of that is indeed tomorrow. So the Romans made a special deal with this local guy, Zacchaeus. In exchange for doing the dirty work for them, the Romans gave Zacchaeus a cut and turned a blind eye on when he overcharged people and pocketed the surplus. With the full protection of the fiat Roman army behind him, Zacchaeus could basically extort any amount of money from anyone in Jericho as he pleased. You had no choice but to pay up or else. I don't know where Zacchaeus had his offices in Jericho, but I imagine it must have been in some kind of green zone. His business had made him very rich, but because the way he had made his fortune, Zacchaeus was perhaps also the loneliest and most despised man in all of Jericho. He was a social outcast, a bad apple, someone who was shunned and virtually despised by everyone. And then Jesus comes to town. Our text doesn't tell us why Zacchaeus got curious to see this wandering rabbi. Perhaps it was just because everybody else was rushing to see the man. Now, being a short fellow, as we know from Sunday school, Zacchaeus the paparazzi runs into some major difficulties. He can't get to the front row. And of course, nobody would even dare to dream making room for him. Everywhere he tries, he gets the cold shoulder. What do you expect? So to outfox his fellow citizens, as is his habit, Zacchaeus climbs into a sycamore tree along the road Jesus is about to pass. Sitting up there in a tree, Zacchaeus is able to observe everything while being hidden from everyone by the dense foliage. It's kind of a symbol of his whole life. And as planned, Jesus comes through, and Zacchaeus is able to catch a glimpse of this Jesus from his perch on high. But Zacchaeus doesn't just get a glimpse. He gets a whole lot more. In fact, more than he bargained for. As he's walking through town, thronged by a large crowd of disciples, admirers, onlookers, and the just plain curious, Jesus suddenly stops. Jesus stops right under the tree in which Zacchaeus is hiding, and Jesus looks up to him. Jesus stops. Whatever he was doing, whatever mission Jesus might have had a minute ago, all that no longer seems to matter. Jesus interrupts everything. the whole procession through Jericho and pays attention to one person, and one person only: Zacchaeus. Yes, Zacchaeus the misfit, the hated collaborator, the bad guy, the traitor, the social outcast. In stopping under that sycamore tree, Jesus ignores all the gossip, all the labels, all the faults, all the bad things for which Zacchaeus could be rightly criticized and condemned. In stopping and speaking to Zacchaeus, Jesus treats him not as a stranger, not as inferior, not as a social outcast as which he is known and treated by everybody else, but simply as a human being. A human being not defined by what he has done, but by what he perhaps might yet become. And in offering to come as a guest to his home, Jesus leads Zacchaeus out of the stifling prison of his self-imposed isolation, out of the prison of his past by which everybody else defines and knows him. Despite the terrible things Zacchaeus has done, Jesus simply accepts him as a fellow human being. Indeed, even more than that, as a beloved child of God, created with the ultimate purpose to reflect and share God's love with others. And we all know and have heard what happens next. In response to the totally unexpected acceptance with which Jesus acknowledges his humanity, Zacchaeus' whole world is turned upside down. And the sign of this radical change in Zacchaeus, the outward expression of his inner transformation, if you will, is not only his extravagant hospitality, but an amazing sense of joy and newfound generosity. Zacchaeus invites Jesus and his friends over to his place and throws on the barbecue to give a big party for them. But even more than that, the despised tax collector, who is used to seeing his fellow human beings only as exploitable sources of revenue, as expendable commodities to be exploited for his own gain, this man suddenly announces that he will give half of his millions to the poor. The callous Roman tax collector, who is used to care only for his own bottom line, suddenly sees those he has defrauded as human beings, just like himself. Zacchaeus suddenly sees the real pain and suffering he has caused them. And he promises to make a 400% restitution to all his victims. How amazing, how exuberantly generous. And in response to Zacchaeus' newfound social conscience and lavish generosity, Jesus says to him, "Today, salvation has come to this house." Now come to think of it, isn't that somewhat of a puzzling statement Jesus is making? For in our text, there's nothing mentioned about Zacchaeus saying anything explicitly religious. Our text says nothing about Zacchaeus making a confession of faith, adopting a creed, taking a church membership class, or anything usually associated with what we call a conversion experience. And yet, Jesus says to Zacchaeus, "Today, salvation has come to this house." One thing seems clear: the way Jesus uses the term salvation must obviously be a little different from the way the term is commonly used. If we take our cue from the scripture passage, then it would seem that Zacchaeus' salvation is somehow connected with giving away half his fortune to the poor. That Zacchaeus' salvation was somehow bound up with paying restitution to his victims. But how can this be? How can something as worldly as throwing a dinner party or setting up a charitable trust fund have anything to do with something as spiritual as a person's salvation? Our text, interestingly, doesn't give us a direct answer, but the story itself makes it, of course, very plain what the answer is. Salvation, according to the story of Zacchaeus, apparently does not consist in just mentally adopting a set of creeds or doctrines. According to Jesus, salvation consists in being freed from the prison of blame and guilt, from the weight of my past mistakes, from the social stigma of others judging me by my faults, by my failings, by my shortcomings. It is by accepting him as he is that Jesus breaks down the walls and gently leads Zacchaeus out of his prison of selfishness in which he has tragically trapped himself by his own fault. Now surely Jesus knows that Zacchaeus is a sinner. Everybody in town does, except Zacchaeus perhaps. Despite, or perhaps because, everybody judges and condemns him, Zacchaeus is not able to honestly look at himself and recognize his deep failings. Paradoxically, Zacchaeus is only able to see, acknowledge, and confess his sins when, through being welcomed and accepted by Jesus, he knows himself as being already forgiven. Only then is he freed to turn his life around in a radical way, not out of fear, but out of infinite gratitude for being forgiven and unconditionally accepted by God as God's beloved child. It is in the encounter with Jesus, in the joyful recognition that he is indeed unconditionally accepted, forgiven, and loved by God, that Zacchaeus is liberated from his past and freed from his selfishness to extend that same care, concern, and generosity to others. So this is what Jesus means when he says to Zacchaeus, "Today, salvation has come to this house." Salvation, according to the story and according to the biblical teaching, consists in discovering that I'm unconditionally loved by God, the God who in Jesus welcomes me with open arms, pays full attention to me, gives me the acceptance that I deserve when he created me, and forgives the sins and the failings of my past, and thus sets me free to extend that same acceptance, that same forgiveness, that same hospitality to all people without exception or reservation. And as for Zacchaeus, my salvation is never only about my own relationship with God, but also about my relationship with others. Like for Zacchaeus, being saved always entails being freed from my self-centeredness, to be as welcoming, generous, and hospitable to others as God is with us. Practically, this will look different for each of us. For some of us, it may include throwing a fancy dinner party. For some, it may include giving half our possessions to the poor, like it did for Zacchaeus. For others, it may mean backing away from a lawsuit with a neighbor, or paying our employees a fair wage. I've been here among you at CPC for only a week, but I've already encountered many, many signs of this joyful generosity, acceptance, and welcome of others, regardless of their background or circumstance. One shining example we saw this morning are the many, many volunteers among you who've been providing a safe place, shelter, and food for several homeless families over the past 2 weeks. Other signs are the support of this community for military families who are struggling, or the women's group sewing blankets, or the hospitality committee making newcomers at CPC feel welcome, These are signs of a very healthy community that seeks to practice and follow Jesus' own example of seeing and treating others, not according to their shortcomings, not according to their failings, not according to the mistakes they may have made, but to accept them as children of God and to see and assist them in discovering their full human potential, to nurture their talents, to encourage and help them to live up and live out their deepest calling as human beings, namely to love and be a blessing to one another. Surely CPC is not perfect, like no church is perfect. But as a newcomer, I see Christ Church as a community that's focused not on criticism, but on mutual encouragement. I see a community focused on acknowledging and affirming one another's gifts. I see a community that does not judge others by where they have been or what they have done in the past, but as a community that seeks to support and encourage one another and delight in the way each of us, by God's grace, is still growing into the fullness of what we may yet become. Many years ago, as a high school student, I had a print posted on my wall, of which I was very fond. This print was from the Irish community called Coromila, which years later received the Nobel Peace Prize for their healing work among Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. The print on my wall showed a caterpillar sitting on a twig. And the saying underneath that image said, "Please be patient. God is not yet finished with me." Jesus was patient with Zacchaeus, so a miracle could happen. In the same way, let's affirm, encourage, and be patient with one another, because God surely is not yet finished with any one of us yet either.